So in this last video on the idea of history and memory, I want to talk about two concepts, the idea of a sense of history, and then a little bit on what happens whenever these different memories, these different remembrances of the past, especially public memory, when they kind of come together in the real world and they challenge each other from the local history. Hello, kitty cat. That is my cat. Her name is Allie. She will sometimes make an appearance like that. All right, so before we talk about those issues, though, one more thing to discuss about collective history. And it relates to the idea, or rather collective memory, and it relates to the idea of individual memory. Because individual memory is influenced by our idea of collective or public memory. The things we believe as a group, in our own certain group, will influence how we see the past ourselves. So sometimes individual memory, we will think about the past and talk about the past through the lens of our individual group. So it's important to remember that as well. All right, so getting back now to the more important part of this video, and that is the sense of history. And what I mean by a sense of history is sort of how we place ourselves within our own world, our own locality, our own nation, our own history during this period. I'm going to take a break, take care of the cat, and get right back to you. Okay, she's gone. I think she's gone anyway. She may make another appearance. Allie will show up from time to time in these things. But back to the issue at hand here, and that's the idea of the sense of history. And what I mean by sense of history, and what historians mean by this idea of a sense of history, is sort of how we position ourselves and use the environment around us in one way, shape, or form to remember our past. Because not everything that we conceive of as our history is something we've experienced firsthand. We have our memories, but we also have the memories of the group. And we also have the memories of the environment around us. And so this sense of history helps us to kind of center ourselves and place ourselves within a larger history of us. Meaning groups, special interest groups, us meaning locations like cities or towns, states or nations. This sense of history helps to define who we are and place ourselves in this broader idea of what history is and how we remember the past. And this comes from a variety of sources, this sense of history. It can come from up high. It can come from like the federal government. It can come from within our own groups and filter down to us. It can come from our families as they tell us stories about the past that center us and show us who we are and tell us about our pasts. This sense of history is multifactored in how it kind of, becomes part of our own self-identity. So it can come from above. I have already said in another video that in this country we don't normally have this approved, national version of history, but certain groups and certain, stronger organizations can kind of impose their own history on others. And so sometimes that's how your history is defined, by a stronger group telling you about your history. This is where the idea of community history and public memory come into play, so that we can, remember these groups even though they're kind of being marginalized by a more oppressive or stronger group along the way. So that's one way to get a sense of history. A more dominant group kind of tells you about your past, and that becomes the official narrative. Other ways that happens, the idea of getting a sense of history, is through popular culture. So whenever we watch movies or read books about history, that gives us a sense of our past, and we see our past through that lens. Now, the issue there is that popular culture is out to make money. And so because they're out to make money, the history you see through their lens is often dictated by how much money is that history going to make us? What is going to be profitable? And so what happens because of that is that our history becomes kind of skewed to a certain degree because people want to make money. And what makes money? Well, dramatic things. What makes money? Things that evoke emotion and drama, things like that. So our sense of history through popular culture, movies and films and that sort of thing, on books, television shows, and so on, can be skewed by the desire for the creator to make money. Another way in which the sense of history kind of affects us is by the physical space around us. So think of it like in terms of your hometown and the historic areas of your hometown and your community. That gives you a sense of your history. I live in a town with a lot of historic buildings, a lot of historic sites and museums and things like that, especially historic sites and buildings. And so that helps define my personal connection to the past because I know where these historic sites are. And these historic sites, for whatever reason, they've been designated as historic, take on more prominence. And so the story they tell, because it's my hometown, my community, the place I live, take more and become more important to me. And so a house that, just an old house has no historic significance. But a house where George Washington slept one night, all of a sudden now has a historical marker in front of it, that becomes significant to my community. So we're the community where George Washington slept one night. And so now my sense of my history is sort of influenced by the George Washington overnight residence. And so that physical location around us influences our sense of place and our sense of how we see ourselves in history. Now, how do all these issues, like the idea of individual history, the idea of collective public memory, the idea of a sense of place, how do all of these issues kind of, relate to oral history? The reason why these are all important to us is because these all are factors in how we each remember the past. As an individual, certain things are going to happen outside stimuli, my own cognitive issues. That's going to cause me to have a certain perspective of my past whenever I give you my oral history. I'm also going to be influenced by groups, and groups themselves will have a certain history. So if you're interviewing a group of a similar, community, a like-minded community, you're going to get a certain oral history account based upon that group's experience. And everybody's history is also kind of influenced by other outside factors, their sense of history, these histories from dominant groups, the history based upon popular culture, the history based upon the important historic sites in my own hometown that I grew up in. These are all going to influence my outlook on the past and my memory of history. That's the theory anyway, that all of these different factors come together to form my own overall idea of what my past is and is going to influence my memory in some way. Now, this is all said not because, to say that oral histories are disingenuous. Facts are facts, and people are going to remember things different ways, which is why it's important whenever you give an oral history, you're not just getting one person. You want to interview a cross-section of a group, a cross-section of a community. You want to interview a cross-section of a town or occupation, what have you. You want to make sure you get a lot of voices that can tell you a story from different perspectives to get a better idea of the event or the time period or the issues that you're trying to cover in your oral history.